The agenda this week considered Canada's 60-year-old fiscal equalization program, looked into the future of pipelines in this country, and asked what's needed to make the post-COVID economic recovery more equitable. The agenda's week in review begins hearing the range of perspectives held by Black voters on the conservative side of the political spectrum. I wanted to get in a sentence or two why you are drawn to conservatism, and I'd like to start with you, Lily.
So for me, coming from a background in Africa where people work hard, things are not handed over to you easily, there is no really safety net. So the conservative concepts really appealed to me because I knew that they really go for people who work hard. They like that. They like the fact that you need to be fiscally responsible. I like the idea that if you work hard, you can make it in this country. So those are the things, and they're very welcoming. So those are the things that really attracted me to the Conservative Party.
And Jamil, what about you?
Well, I'm motivated by, I think, two goals when it comes to politics. The first one is how do we fight for a more fair, just society? And then the second one is how do we protect the good things about our country that have made it possible for the current progress that we have? And I think that politics is how we can best achieve both of those goals.
And Carmen, what about you?
Well, I believe in the freedom to believe, to work, freedom of religion. And as Lily says, you work hard and you can make it.
And what about you, Frances?
I actually find being a Black conservative almost an act of activism. I think it forces many people to have challenging conversations, and I think it creates a much broader political spectrum, which I think is good for all Canadians.
And Jamil, obviously there are different kinds of Black conservatives, but throughout Canadian history, what have been the key features of Black conservatism?
Yeah, I think it's important to recognize that Black conservative politics is not about being a Black person who's a member of a certain party. It's a way of thinking. It's a philosophy. It's an approach to politics and activism that has many centuries of effort behind it. And I look at it as being, historically, it's about acknowledging that there are good things in our country that we want to protect and fighting to belong in that country and to make it better without dismantling the positive gains that have been made. So when we think about having appreciating mixed market capitalism, for example, or freedom of speech and freedom of religion, these are things that Black conservatives over the years have valued and have fought to protect, but have also made the effort to challenge Canada to be better. And to me, that is what the Black conservative tradition is about.
And just to build on that, Frances, to go back on something that you just said about how you feel being a Black conservative is an act of is activism itself. Can you expand on that, please?
I look at it as an act of activism, not just in elections, but within the party. The fact of the matter is every political party has racist origins. They all started without us. And so I think we've had a big issue in being pigeonholed into one area of politics. And that means that our views are not being really fairly debated. And so this year has been actually quite amazing to see such a hunger and an interest for this perspective to come forward. And it's a very broad perspective. I think you'll notice on the panel as we talk, my opinion can be very different from that of some of the other candidates or Jamil. But one thing I've noticed is there's space for all of us here. We just have to work and make it.
I want to talk more about that diversity in a second, and we'll also talk about racism. But Lily, Canada's first ever Black MP and federal cabinet minister was a conservative, Lincoln Alexander. He was elected to the House of Commons in 1968. Why do you think it was conservatives that achieved that first in this country?
Like I said before, conservatives don't segment people by race. And they don't segment people by your income level. They accept you if you're able to deliver. So I am almost certain that at that time they were looking at this guy who could actually be able to deliver for their community and said, okay, come and be in the tent. And I think that is what the Conservative Party is about. And that's what we should be talking about all the time. In the media, trying to put some of these great things that they've done and feeling comfortable. I think that guy in 1968 felt as comfortable as I am right now in 2021.
I would argue was less comfortable, and maybe that's why he did it. I know, speaking on his history, if I looked back at some of the legislation he brought forward and talked to people who worked with him, he went through difficult experiences within the party and used that to help bring the party forward. So I think when we talk about it, we have to always remember the challenges that exist in bringing in new space for our community.
Why do you think he was able to achieve that, though, in 1968, Frances?
Because he was willing to fight. Black political engagement involves pushing into systems that weren't designed for us or by us. And so I've learned that if I want my voice to be heard, I have to ensure that I'm at the table. I can't ask, I have to create the space for myself.
One of the things about equalization that's important is it's a program. It's about moral obligation to share across territory, but it's also a very pragmatic, hard-headed program. So if the details are not working, if the program is not functioning properly, then what you have to do is change it, tinker with it, remake it. Alberta has some legitimate problems right now. It is possible to change the program that it receives to ensure that it gets more money per capita for drastic drops in revenue. It is a very good way of fixing things. Don't throw out the program, adjust the details.
Well, now you're talking about the art of the possible as opposed to the art of sharing. And to that, I'm going to the former politician among us, because, Natalie, you were, of course, once upon a time a member of the Ontario legislature. And we're now talking about the realm of politics here. When the Trudeau government announced in 2018 that it was not going to renegotiate the equalization agreement, but rather freeze in place the status quo for 5 years, that made a lot of people unhappy. Do you think it was the right move to freeze the current agreement rather than renegotiate it?
Well, there's always an issue about, do you spend a lot of energy renegotiating at that time, or do you develop alternative programs? I mean, I think Mary is right. It is a program. It should be tinkered with. It should be adapted. And I think I'm part of, as many are, looking at what alternatives there could be in the future for this program. But there are others, and that's not the only program that exists to support a vision of equality among citizens in Canada. So I think it will have to be readjusted, probably. But the fundamental way that I think we want to say, and the key message here, is when Alberta says we want to opt out of this program, we're trying to say that's not the right way, because it is an important program for all of us and for the future of the Federation, essentially.
We should explain, I guess, Mary, that Alberta is not... It's not the taxpayers of Alberta that are actually sending money to the taxpayers of Quebec, right? That's not how it works. It's not a province-to-province transfer, right?
No, it's been a very difficult thing to clarify. Jason Kenney keeps talking about Alberta sending money, and look at the amount Quebec's getting. Actually, all federal taxpayers, they send the money to Ottawa, and Ottawa redistributes it. That charge that Alberta is sending money has been very damaging, and it's wrong.
All right, in which case, Trevor, let me get your view on this, because Jason Kenney, the Premier of Alberta, has often talked about having a referendum among Alberta citizens to see whether or not equalization should continue. Can you talk to us about the pluses and minuses of having a referendum on this issue?
Sure, and it does look like that will go ahead in October of this year. So Mary mentioned earlier in the program the stabilization program federally. This is separate from equalization, meant to support provinces that have big drops in revenue. The federal government did expand the size of that program so that it would cover more of revenue drops of provinces, but it wasn't as much as what Alberta was hoping for. And so in response, Premier Kenney here did recommit to a referendum, and I have a real hard time seeing him backing down from that commitment. So in October, Albertans will vote. I won't speculate on which way it will go, but if they vote to remove equalization from the Constitution, this doesn't really have any legal force. Yeah. Equalization is a federal program completely at the discretion of the federal government to design and implement. It's not something that provinces have any formal role in at all. Politically, I think another angle of the referendum is that they want to, quote, force the federal government to the table in order to negotiate equalization. But there is already ongoing negotiations between the federal and provincial governments. There's a standing committee on fiscal transfers that meets roughly twice a year. And so any concerns, and there are legitimate concerns, can be raised and explored and discussed through the regular procedures that already exist. So we're already at the table. The referendum doesn't have any legal force. It's really a uniquely political tool that might serve provincial ends rather than changing anything federally.
There's no way you can take 173 billion barrels out of the ground and burn it, and we still have a safe climate. But more importantly, I think the way the world is moving is there is not going to be a market for that oil. And we need to deal with that, and we need to prepare Canadians. And frankly, the rest of the country is going to have to help out Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Newfoundland as we go through this transition. Canada has a lot of experience on natural resources sort of coming and going in booms, and we need to do a lot better job this time than we did with, say, the cod or the forestry industries in BC, Ontario, Quebec. Because in this case, fossil fuels are going away within decades. They're not going to go away overnight, but we're talking an unprecedented move away from this energy source if we're going to have a stable climate for our kids. And doing that can actually create great, good new jobs, but they're going to be different jobs, and we need to help people through that transition.
Andrew, can I get you to follow up on that?
Yeah, I think one of the issues with a lot of this is we're talking about large global systems and bringing it down to talk about individual projects, or we're talking about a large resource and bringing it down to talk about individual projects. I mean, if you talk about Prime Minister Trudeau's number about 170 billion barrels, there's nothing in his statement there even that said we're going to dig every barrel out of the ground or pump every barrel out of the ground or what have you. He's saying rightly that there's no country in the world that's going to look at that resource and just turn tail and walk away. They're going to evaluate what it does for them and what the best strategy is to deal with that resource. And, to put it in context, we could produce oil sands at the rate that we're producing them today for probably a couple hundred years before we produce that many barrels of oil. So that's not the policy discussion we're having, plus or minus 170 billion barrels or plus or minus 2 trillion barrels, as some people have done. It's, plus it's variations around the current rate and whether we're building a few new projects or no new projects, whether we're shutting down existing ones or running the existing ones to the end of their lifespan. I think that's the kind of area where the conversation needs to take place. And it's really hard to get that conversation to a level where we're meaningfully moving the dial on global emissions. And it's not to say we shouldn't act on climate change. It's just to say that the global energy system is massive and we're burning fossil fuels, an almost mind-boggling amount of fossil fuels every day. So each individual thing necessarily looks small. That doesn't mean don't do anything about it, but it means that when you're looking at those individual decisions, you can't make one project or one resource decision or one country's policy the make or break thing for action on climate change. So what I would say, though, to Keith's point is I think he's right about the transition, but I think it comes in a different way than the way he's framed it, which is it comes earlier for a province like Alberta because the boom in Alberta wasn't one about producing oil and windfall royalty revenues. It was about producing oil sands projects. And the reason why the Alberta economy boomed, all that jobs and employment, was not just the oil money getting spent, it was the projects getting built. And so it's almost that growth rate of production that was driving the boom in Alberta, not just the production itself. And so even if, we can have an argument about how much oil the world's going to use in 2030 or not going to use, but what's important to our economy in a way and to Canada is that question of the rate of change of Canadian production. And I think that we can agree that the outlook there has changed dramatically. And so the bets people were making on new projects year after year after year, that's gone away no matter what. And it's gone away because of price, it's gone away because of climate, it's gone away because of lead times, and it's disrupting a whole set of people who actually don't necessarily live that close to where the oil is produced.
Well, we just got a few minutes left here, and I want to get both Warren and Kristen on this next question, which is, this sounds like a massive, for the ages, national project ahead of us. We've got to wean ourselves off fossil fuels. We've got to embrace renewables more. We've got to do something big about climate change. And we've got to help people in Saskatchewan and Alberta and Newfoundland and Labrador to make sure that they aren't crushed as a result of this transition. Warren, how in heaven's name do we realistically do all that?
Well, the answer is that there's a lot of parts here. You know, we need to have worker retraining. We need to be investing in the new renewable technologies. One thing that we haven't talked about is that, you know, oil is still a resource and you can use it for things other than fuel. And one of the things that I think Canada should be looking at is, can we be using that oil for other value-added products, things that aren't contributing to the GHGs, things that are more durable. Plastics is obviously a big example. We obviously want to avoid microplastics and the problems are there. There are a lot of things that we can do, but we have a lot of smart people in this country, and I think we can make this transition. We need to develop a vision for where we want to get to.
Kristen, take the last word on this, if you would.
I agree. This is probably the great challenge of our times, the energy transition, and how we are going to get through this transition, being a country that has, for the past few decades, really made so much of our money off of oil and gas in particular. But one thing I would also say is that I think we're also going to see the federal government try to take more decisive and bold action on climate change.
Just to set the table for our discussion, we do have a few maps I want to get through. So Sheldon, if you could please bring in the maps. Here's a map of the city's COVID-19 cases to date. Lots of cases in the northwest part of Toronto and parts of Scarborough. A couple of hotspots in East York, downtown, and Etobicoke, and very few cases in Midtown. We have another map here, and here's a map from the 2016 census of low-income neighborhoods in Toronto. Again, we see parts of Scarborough, the Northwest, East York, and downtown with higher percentage of low-income neighborhoods. Jennifer, I wanted to ask you the first question. We do see maps of Toronto, but obviously what's happening is not just isolated to the 416, correct?
That's right. The same patterns that we've seen playing out in the city of Toronto, where lower income neighborhoods, where more people are essential workers, more people live in cramped housing, are at higher risk of COVID-19. That's a pattern that's held true across not just the province, but the country and in other parts of the world as well. So some of these patterns you're seeing where the dark shaded parts of the map are sort of aligning with where people are also more lower income and working a lot of these essential jobs where they can't stay at home. That tends to be where COVID cases have concentrated.
And Deputy Mayor, what do these maps tell us about the unequal impact of COVID-19?
Well, I think the map tells us a lot, but I think it's really important for us to understand that COVID didn't create this problem. In fact, this problem existed well before COVID. And really what it's demonstrating to us, though, that we have to act, we have to help people. And as has been stated before, the conditions of cramped housing, the conditions with respect to many of the frontline workers who are from specific areas who are, predisposed to other issues such as lack of appropriate housing, food insecurity, lack of education, and so on. And so what it tells us is that we have lots of work to do. And in fact, we have to put not only policies in place and not only relying on government to actually do everything, but it is a collaborative approach as a society that we have to take the next step in order to address this inequality. It's intolerable that these conditions have been allowed to fester, and the pandemic has definitely shown us that there is a tremendous gap that has existed in our society that really needs to be addressed, and efforts are actually being made to address those But at the same time, while we take these necessary steps and efforts to address them, we also have to measure for impact, because if we don't measure for impact, we will never know whether or not we're being successful.
And just to build on what the deputy mayor said, Nakima, he said that some of the conditions that we're seeing right now existed before the pandemic. The title of tonight's program is Equity, Economic Recovery, and COVID-19. What does equity look like to you?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, because equity is a word that, especially since all of the activism that we've seen over the course of the summer months, that has been tossed around a lot. But I think it's really important that we define the word. So equity for us is really about understanding that some communities have been disproportionately impacted by this pandemic. Those communities are reflected in geographic areas, but also ethnocultural communities. So we're focused on looking at the overrepresentation of Black communities in the number of COVID-19 cases. So when we think about responses and our economic recovery, equity means actually ensuring not just a one-size-fits-all approach, but targeted approaches that are actually going to address not just the crisis response to the disproportionalities we're seeing right now, but addressing the systemic issues, the root causes, the reasons why these disproportionalities have existed in the first place.
And Jeffrey, to build on what Nakima was saying, you know, when we do think about recovery, one size fits all might not be what we're looking at. For the Indigenous community, how has the pandemic impacted the inequalities that the Indigenous community are experiencing in the city?
Sure, yeah. So, my fellow panelists have really hit the nail on the head with a lot of it. I think we're seeing Indigenous people in really dense urban environments where they need to go to work on overcrowded transit systems on a daily basis, and we're seeing rapid spread. But I think we also need to remember that this is not the first pandemic Indigenous people on Turtle Island have experienced, and there's a lot of intergenerational trauma about historical pandemics that have impacted communities. So alongside the historical issues that have been made more acute related to poverty and housing, we're seeing this secondary shadow pandemic related to mental health and, in some cases, substance abuse and family violence that is really becoming more acute in the face of this pandemic.
What you just said was really interesting in the sense that this is not the first pandemic that the Indigenous community has experienced. Why is that important for us to acknowledge?
I think it's important because we need to recognize that people are dealing with a lot of intergenerational trauma right now, and we need trauma-informed land-based tools and practices to be able to address the way that this pandemic is impacting Indigenous people. It also has a lot to do with vaccine hesitancy, right? Because Indigenous people have a very long history of, in fact, experimentation at the hands of settler medicine.
That's just some of what we covered this week on The Agenda. For more, including the full conversations, you can visit our website, tvo.org, our YouTube channel at youtube.com/theagenda, or our Twitter feed, twitter.com/theagenda.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.